inshallah.
So, Alhamdulillah, we return back to our class, going from the beginning of the Quran. So, the last few weeks, what did we talk about? Just as a recap, we talked about the isti'adah, which is the act of seeking refuge, which a lot of people interpret as just being saying, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. And we discussed that in detail, some of the meanings of that. And then we talked about in detail the meanings of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We talked about the meaning of the ba in B, what that means when we say with or in. We talked about some of the potential meanings of the word Allah. We talked about Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim in a little bit of detail and the various shades of meaning and nuances that they have. And then the last couple of weeks we talked about the phrase Alhamdulillah and the fact that in a lot of places in the Quran we see it comes at the end of something or upon the completeness of something. And then last week we talked about the phrase Rabbul Alameen, often translated as the Lord of the Worlds, and we looked at different ways of looking at that. We looked in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, chapter 26, which has a definition of Rabbul Alameen given by Musa and Ibrahim, and also in Surah 26 is the most times that the phrase Rabbul Alameen is used in the whole Quran. So that's a quick summary of what we've already talked about. So we're in Al-Fatiha, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and the next ayah is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Now, since we already discussed Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim in a lot of detail when we discussed Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, when we discussed that phrase, I'll skip over this ayah because we already kind of went through that in detail. And we'll go to the next ayah, which is Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, which is often translated as Master.
Why does Allah repeat Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim?
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer to that. That is a good question though. Some of that discussion probably lies in whether or not we consider Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim as being the first ayah of Al-Fatiha and of the Quran or not, which I personally do. Some people don't.
Right.
So people who don't consider that to be the first ayah, but they consider Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen as the first ayah, they perhaps wouldn't see it as being repeated. But for someone like me who does consider that to be the first ayah, why is that repeated? That is a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. Only thing I can say is we understand some of the meanings of Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim from what we previously studied, and maybe inshallah as we go further in our journey of studying the Quran, we'll find something that explains more. If the phrase of Bismillah is the first ayah, then why is that repeated again?
True.
I would imagine
Okay.
it flows from Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, right? That's just off the top of my head. So when you even when you think about the word Rabb, right? There's potentially it's connected to that because the word Rabb, which is often translated as Lord, is also connected to Ar-Rahman. For example, there's an ayah, Inna Rabbakum Ar-Rahman. Truly your Rabb is Ar-Rahman. So it could have to do with unpacking him being Rabbil Alameen, right? So last time when we talked about Rabbil Alameen and we looked at the definition of Musa, and Musa defined it in this very universal way. He said, Rabbus samawati wal ardi wa ma baynahuma, the Lord of the heavens and the earth and what is between them. And then he gave a couple other statements about Rabbul Alameen. And then Ibrahim defined it in this very specific way, right? Where he said, he defined it in a very personal way is probably a better way of saying that, where he said, فإنهم عدو لي إلا رب العالمين الذي خلقني فهو يهدين. The one who created me, so he guides me. والذي هو يطعمني ويسقين, and the one who feeds me and gives me to drink. وإذا مرضت فهو يشفين, and when I am sick, then he cures me. والذي والذي هو يميتني ثم يحيين. And or والذي يميتني ثم يحيين. Does it repeat huwa there? Let me look that up. Just to make sure I'm quoting it right. No, he doesn't repeat huwa. I thought that sounded wrong. والذي يميتني ثم يحيين, and the one who causes me to die and gives me life. والذي أطمع أن يغفر لي خطيئتي يوم الدين, and the one who I hope will forgive my sin on the day of Yawm Ad-Deen. See, that's the phrase that's in the next ayah we're going to.
Right.
Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen.
Yeah, we,
So Yawm Ad-Deen. So potentially, and Allah knows best, this is something we would have to study more to be certain.
okay.
Well, I want to explain
I
as I'm talking about it, it's coming to my mind more. But like I said, we would have to study it because I'm not 100% sure. But potentially, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim could be, see how in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, in the definition of Ibrahim and in the definition of Musa, you have two different aspects. You have a universal aspect and you have a personal aspect. So could it potentially be that when he says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, that the unpacking of Rabbil Alameen is in a universal way represented by Ar-Rahman, and in a personal way represented by Ar-Rahim, possibly.
or is it that the Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim in the first ayat refers to a more universal, and the second Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim is the more or the first is more personal and more second is more universal because they're separate. They're mentioned twice.
Yeah, potentially. Or another way of thinking about that is Bismillah, in the name of Allah. Allah is universal and Allah is personal. So when you mention Allah in a universal sense with Ar-Rahman, and then you mention also Allah in a personal sense, which is Rahim, Ar-Rahim. And then again, when you mention Rabbil Alameen, then you repeat it because now it's unpacking Rabbil Alameen in a universal and a personal sense. Potentially.
No, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, that could be. But I think that's something that, like I said, needs to be studied more. I'm not completely clear on that.
Right.
But alhamdulillah, I think that's a good starting point to start to think about potentially why it's repeated and why it follows like it does in the sequence of Al-Fatiha. And I think it's also interesting in the definition of Ibrahim, when he's given the definition of Rabbil Alameen, at the end of his definition, he says, وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ, and the one that I hope will forgive my sins on Yawm Ad-Deen, which loosely translated the day of recompense. But we're going to study that term in a little bit more detail. But I think that's interesting because that's in his definition of Rabbil Alameen. And then also in Al-Fatiha, we have Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. So is Yawm Ad-Deen connected also to Rabbil Alameen? So that's another thing to think about. There's so many layers to unpack about the Quran. That's one of the beautiful things about it. So today I want to talk a little bit about this phrase Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, focusing mostly on the first part, and then probably next week we'll focus more on the second part, Yawm Ad-Deen. Because why is it called Yawm Ad-Deen and they translate it as the day of recompense? Or the day of judgment? What does ad-deen actually mean? Because that's also a word that we use sometimes to mean religion. So this word is a very versatile word that's used in different contexts. So we want to unpack it a little bit. And we'll see some of it today. But we'll go more into detail about it next week. So this phrase, Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, can be translated as the owner of, let's just say Yawm Ad-Deen is the day of recompense until we go further into studying it. We'll just use that as our translation. So Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen is the owner of the day of recompense, the owner or the controller of the day of recompense. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you look in the different recitations of the Quran, they say that this part of Al-Fatiha could be recited in one of two ways. You can say Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, which means owner of the day of judgment. So Malik, when you phrase it like that, it means owner. But you can also say Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, which then means king of the day of judgment. Now, for those of us who are used to speaking English or whatever other language we might speak, we might not be used to how Arabic distinguishes between words by just the vowel sound. So I want to explain it a little bit more because for us as English speakers, it might sound pretty much the same. But in Arabic, you have short vowels and you have long vowels. Okay, so a short vowel is basically like one count. So if I was to say ma with the a sound, ma, one count, that would be a short vowel. But if I was to lengthen that pronunciation to two counts, where I can use my finger to count, right? Then I would say Maaliki. It's going to be longer, Maaliki. So you have Maaliki, Maaliki. Each word has one count, or I'm sorry, each vowel has one count or one beat. Maaliki. I can say it like that, and if I do that, that means king. Maaliki. One beat each vowel, Maaliki. That means king. But if I lengthen the first vowel and I say Maaliki, then that means owner, right? But they're both from the same root word, or they're both from the same root letters, as you know from a lot of our classes that we've been talking about. We can go back to a 3-letter root word for the vast majority of Arabic words that we study. So both of these, whether we say Maliki, meaning owner, or Maliki, meaning king, both of those go back to the 3-letter root word Mim, Lam, and Kaf. Mim, Lam, and Kaf, or M, L, and K. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to study some of the meaning of those root letters, so that way we can get a better understanding of what's being said here in Al-Fatiha. Assuming that Yawm Ad-Deen means the day of recompense, what do we mean when we're referring to Allah as Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, as the owner of Yawm Ad-Deen, or Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, the king of Yawm Ad-Deen? So some of the way to understand that is to look at some of the verses where those root letters, those 3 root letters, are used. So one author, just to give an Arabic definition, the author who has the 14-volume book that we rely on a lot in our classes, he defines the root meaning of these 3 letters, Mim, Lam, and Kaf, or M, L, and K, as التسلط على شيء بحيث يكون اختياره بيده. التسلط على شيء بحيث يكون اختياره بيده. He defines it as meaning to have control or authority over something, such that you have the way he phrases it in Arabic is kind of interesting, because the way Arabic sounds, and when you translate it to English, it sounds really weird. But he's saying بحيث يكون اختياره بيده, such that the choice is in his hand. So meaning basically that Mim, Lam, and Kaf, those 3 letters, the root meaning of those 3 letters, or M, L, and K, means that you have authority over something, such that you have the choice of how to manage that thing. That's how I would translate that in other words, right? So you have authority over something to the point where you have the ability to choose what to do with that thing or how to manage that thing. Okay, so that's just starting off with the root Arabic meaning of the word, of the 3 letters. So now let's go to some of the verses that use these 3 root letters in various forms, and let's try to see the context that it's used in. So the first place we're going to go is 5:25, chapter 5, verse 25. And this is relating what Musa said, the statement of Musa with regards to him and his brother, when the people that Musa was with didn't want to enter the Holy Land. Musa says, قَالَ رَبِّي إِنِّي لَا أَمْلِكُ إِلَّا نَفْسِي وَأَخِي. He said, my Lord, la amliku, I do not amliku. So the word that's used in Arabic is amliku, which is a variation of the root word Mim, Lam, Kaf, or those 3 letters. And it means, it's the present tense form, using it in the first person, meaning I. So amliku, meaning I possess, basically. I do not possess the authority, or I do not possess the ability to control basically. La amliku illa nafsi wa akhi, except for myself and my brother. So that gives us one example of how this word is used in the Quran, because he's with his people and he tells his people, when we go back to verse 21, Ya qawmi udkhulu al-ard al-muqaddasa. He says, "Oh my people, enter the Holy Land." And there's a few verses that tells the details about why they wouldn't do that. And finally at the end, Musa says, قال ربي إني لا أملك إلا نفسي وأخي. He says, I do not control or possess the control over anyone except for myself and my brother. In other words, I don't have any mulk. So mulk is like the noun that we would use, meaning any dominion, authority, or control. I don't have that over my people, and I can't make them do that. The only ones that I have mulk over, amliku, is myself and my brother. Another example is in chapter 7, verse 188. So chapter 7, verse 188, and actually this is just one example of a concept that's talked about in the Quran in a few different verses. He says, قُلْ لَا أَمْلِكُ إِلَّا قُلْ لَا أَمْلِكُ لِنَفْسِي نَفْعًا وَلَا ضَرًّا إِلَّا مَا شَاءَ اللَّهِ. He said, say, I do not possess amliku. So it uses again the first person from that three-letter root, mim, lam, and kaf, or MLK. La amliku. I do not possess or control for myself, li nafsi, naf'an wala darran illa ma sha Allah. Any benefit or any harm except for whatever Allah wills. وَلَوْ كُنْتُ أَعْلَمُ الْغَيْبَ لَاسْتَكْثَرْتُ مِنَ الْخَيْرِ وَمَا مَسَّنِيَ السُّوءُ. And if I were to know the unseen, I would have found abundant goodness and no evil would have touched me. Okay? So this concept, which is repeated in a few different verses, is basically telling us to say. So when the Quran tells us to say, قُل, saying doesn't necessarily just mean saying something verbally, although that could be one way that we say it. But saying it could also mean that this becomes part of your self-talk, part of the things that you say to yourself, that you say as a concept, that you develop internally to remember. So say, La amliku li nafsi naf'an wala darran illa ma sha Allah. This is something that should be part of our self-talk, that we should say to ourselves, that I don't possess or control for myself any benefit or harm except for whatever Allah wills. Another example of the usage of this word is in 82:19. So in 82:19, he says, now this is going to get more, as we go through the verses, we're getting closer and closer to the usage of this root word in reference specifically to the verse that we're studying in Al-Fatiha, which is Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, the owner or master of Yawm Ad-Deen, of the Day of Recompense, or Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, the king of the Day of Recompense. So in this surah, he says, if we start actually at verse 14, he says, وَإِنَّ الْفُجَّارَ لَفِي جَحِيمٍ. And truly the corrupt people are in Jahim, loosely the hellfire. يَصْلَوْنَهَا يَوْمَ الدِّينِ. They will enter it يَوْمَ الدِّينِ, on the day of recompense. وَمَا هُمْ عَنْهَا بِغَائِبِينَ. And they will not be absent from it. Okay, now, because we're defining, this is beautiful. Like, this is how the Quran explains itself, because we're trying to define this phrase, Maaliki or Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. So what is Yawm Ad-Deen? This surah says in verse 17, so this is 82:17. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ الدِّينِ. The surah asks us, what will make you know? وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ. What will make you know what is Yawm Ad-Deen? It asks us, what will make you know what is Yawm Ad-Deen? ثُمَّ مَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ الدِّينِ. Then what will make you know what is Yawm Ad-Deen? Yawma, then the last verse is going to actually give us a definition. Yawma la tamliku. Listen to the exact wording. Yawma la tamliku nafsun li nafsin shay'a. It's the day when no nafs, no soul will tamliku, which is from the three-letter root, mim lam kaf. No soul will tamliku, will possess or control or own or have authority, li nafsin shay'a. No soul will control, possess, or have authority for any other soul. Wal amru yawma idhin lillah. And the command or the matter or the affair that day is for Allah. So what is Yawm Ad-Deen? He defined it. وما أدراك ما يوم الدين ثم ما أدراك ما يوم الدين يوم لا تملك. See how it goes together? Because in Al-Fatiha he says Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. He is the owner of Yawm Ad-Deen. He is the one who controls any benefits or harms for any soul on that day. Yawma la tamliku nafsun li nafsin shay'a. It's the day when no soul will possess or control anything for another soul. Wal amru yawma idhin lillah. And the matter, the affair, the command that day is for Allah. So in other words, he's the Malik of that day. He's the one who yamliku on that day, right? Beautiful how the Quran fits together like that. And to be honest, we could really suffice ourselves with this part right here and explaining it, and that would probably be sufficient. But there are some other verses that illuminate even more the meaning of that root word, so I want to share those too. So if we go to 27:23, is going to be another verse. So 27:23 is referring to the woman who was ruling Saba, the place called Saba. Now, I've mentioned this before in some of our other classes, but I want to repeat it again because I think that it's a valuable, in my opinion, a valuable observation. Sometimes when we talk about this story, people refer to her as Malikatu Saba. They refer to her as the queen of Saba, as the queen of Sheba. However, personally, whenever I reference this story from the Quran, I say the woman who was ruling Sheba or Saba. Why? Because if we look at how the Quran describes her with a verb. So it says, Inni wajadtu mra'atan tamlikuhum. That I found a woman tamlikuhum, ruling them. Okay, so first of all, from our study that we've done so far of the root of this word, mim lam kaf, meaning tamlikuhum, meaning having authority over them in a way that she has the ability to choose how to handle whatever comes up in her realm. Okay, but the other thing is, why doesn't the Quran describe her as Malika? Like, why doesn't it say, Inni wajadtu Malikatan? I found a queen. Why doesn't the Quran say that? Why does it say, Imra'atan tamlikuhum? A woman who is ruling them or controlling them or has authority over them. I think this is really beautiful because when we go back to some of our discussions about the difference between a noun and a verb, what does a noun indicate? Because Melika, a queen, would be a noun, but she's being described as a verb, or her activity is being described as a verb, ruling them. And what's the difference? What's a noun? A noun refers to a permanent, established quality, and a verb refers to an action that comes about at certain times, right? But it's not necessarily a permanent and established quality. So I find it to be very interesting that the Quran doesn't describe her as a queen as if like that's part of her permanent identity. And I think that shows, Allah knows best, the difference between power and leadership when it comes to males versus power and leadership when it comes to females. Because as males, a lot of times we seek power as an identity. That's why sometimes we're aggressive. We're socialized to believe that it's okay to express aggressiveness, to assert ourselves, to express things from anger. We're not as comfortable with expressing our true emotions. We're not as comfortable with saying someone hurt my feelings, but rather we would get upset and angry and lash out, right? Whereas when it comes to power dynamics from a more feminine or female perspective, um, it's a little bit different. It's more about connectivity and making and building relationships. It's not necessarily an ego thing like it is sometimes with us as men. So I think it's really beautiful that the Quran doesn't describe that as part of her identity. So I think there's something in that for us to learn, for all of us to learn, but especially us as men to learn about how to take our ego out of positions of power and authority, how to separate those things. That a position of power or authority can be an action that you do, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a part of your identity that you have this ego thing with. And when you take that out of your identity, it makes it easier for you to connect with other people and to be a better leader. And actually, you can see this in the rest of the story. So in the rest of the story, as you read through it, so Suleiman sends her a letter, etc. Like there's a lot of details, right? But then what happens after Suleiman sends her a letter? She directs the letter and the discussion about the letter to the council that she has. She says, قالت يا أيها الملأ إني ألقي إلي كتاب كريم. She says, "O my council, there has been sent to me a noble letter. إنه من سليمان وإنه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Truly it is from Suleiman, and truly it is in the name of Allah, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim." And then the letter says, "Allah ta'lu alayya." Do not exalt yourself over me. Wa'tuni muslimin, and come to me muslimin. So look at the difference, right? Suleiman, because a lot of times when we read these stories, we assume because Suleiman is, one of the messengers, etc. We assume that he's the hero of the story and he's the example in the story. But I think also we should look at the other people that are in the story and what can we learn from them, right? So look at her ability to have counsel and consultation with the people with her, and look at how Suleiman came to her in the sense of almost kind of aggressive, like, don't exalt yourself over me, right? And then if you keep reading, look what she said in verse 32. قالت يا أيها الملأ. She said, "O my council, أفتوني في أمري. Give me your verdict in my affair. ما كنت قاطعة أمرا حتى تشهدون. I don't decide anything until you bear witness for me." So she is actually doing what we would call in the Quran, we would call shura, which is mutual consultation. And that's actually what Allah describes the believers with. He says, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ. That their matters, their affairs are conducted by shura, consultation amongst them, right? And then they respond by saying, قَالُوا نَحْنُ أُولُو قُوَّةٍ وَأُولُو بَأْسٍ شَدِيدٍ. They say, we possess great power and great warfare. وَالْأَمْرُ إِلَيْكَ. But the command is for you. فَانْظُرِي مَاذَا تَأْمُرِينَ. So look to see what you would order and command. And then she says, قَالَتْ إِنَّ الْمُلُوكَ. So when she refers to the kings as a noun, look how she describes them. قَالَتْ إِنَّ الْمُلُوكَ. She says, truly the kings, إِذَا دَخَلُوا قَرْيَةً أَفْسَدُوهَا. When they enter a town, they spoil it. See how the power dynamics are being discussed here? Like, look at her perspective. She's tamlikuhum as an action. She's ruling them, not as a noun in the sense of that this is her identity, right? But then when she describes kings as a noun, as part of their identity, she describes them as people who enter a town and afsaduha. They just spoil it and ruin it and just mess it up. وَجَعَلُوا أَعِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً. And they make the honorable of the people in that town to be lowly. وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ. And likewise they do. So this is another usage of, we see in this story, the root word mim, lam, and kaf, or MLK, in the description of imra'atan tamlikuhum, a woman who was ruling them. And like I said in the beginning, that's why personally I don't like to refer to her as some people do as Malikatu Saba, the queen of Saba, because the Quran describes her differently. And I think even if what my perception or my observation of why the Quran describes her like that is not correct, even still we should respect the wording of the Quran, and we should use the way that the Quran described her and think about why that might be. So another example of the usage of this word is in chapter 17 verse 100. So chapter 17 verse 100, he says, قل لو أنتم تملكون خزائن رحمة ربي إذا لأمسكتم خشية الإنفاق. He says, say, if you were to possess the storehouses of the mercy of your Lord, then in that case you would withhold out of fear of spending or out of fear of it being depleted. Okay, so the main point that I want to look at this verse is because, again, we're trying to get a sense of the meaning of this root word, mim, lam, and kaf, or MLK. And we said in the beginning that one definition of it is at-tasallut ala shay'in bihaythu yakunu ikhtiyaruhu biyadihi. That it means to control or to have authority over something such that the choice of how to deal with that thing is in that person's hand. Like they have the choice of how to deal with it. So it means to possess or to control or to own something such that you can make the decision on what to do with it, right? So we see an example of that in this verse, because he says, say, if you, قُلْ لَوْ أَنْتُمْ تَمْلِكُونَ, if you were to tamlikun, if you were to control or to have authority or to have possession of khaza'ina rahmati rabbi, the storehouses of the mercy of your Lord, in that case you would withhold. You would not want to give out the mercy because you would fear that you would lose it, it would be depleted. So the idea here is that it shows us that the implication of tamlikun, you controlling or possessing it, is that la'amsaktum, you would have the ability to withhold it. You would have the choice to withhold it. So that supports that definition. Another good example is, oh, I had it. Where is it? Oh, I found it. 1276. So I was like, I knew I wrote that verse down. So chapter 12, verse 76. So this is the story of Yusuf. So in the story of Yusuf, at the end of the story, when Yusuf becomes the person who is in charge of the storehouses of the land, so he's able to distribute the resources. And then his brothers come and he wants to keep his brother, right? And it's part of Allah's plan to allow him to keep his brother, but he couldn't just keep him. So what happened was Allah brought about a situation where he would be able to keep his brother. So this is how it's described in the Quran. He says, كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا لِيُوسُف. Likewise did we plan for Yusuf. مَا كَانَ لِيَأْخُذَ أَخَاهُ. It was not allowable for him that he could take his brother فِي دِينِ الْمَلِكِ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. In the deen of the Malik. In the deen of the Malik. I'm curious how different people translate this, because you can hear in the Arabic the words that are being used is the word deen, right? Fi deen al-Malik, in the deen of the Malik. So does he say religion here, or what does he say? Let's see what he says. He cannot take his brother under the king's law.
It says the king's law.
The king's law, yeah, that's what this one says too. The king's law, which is not bad, because this is one of the verses that also aid us in our understanding of the word deen, right? Because a lot of times deen is a very versatile word in the context that it's used in the Quran. And this is a word that we're going to go into in a lot more detail next week, because we're analyzing this phrase, Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen, right? But just for starters, this verse is a verse that helps us to unpack that, because Here, deen is being used in reference to the law of the king. And you can see that from the context, because he's saying this situation came about, and the details of the situation are in this context. But just to summarize it, the situation came about where Allah made it possible for Yusuf to keep his brother with him. And Allah describes that by saying, كَذَلِكَ كِدْنَا لِيُوسُف. Likewise, we did plan for Yusuf. We arranged this and planned for Yusuf for this to come about. And then he explains, مَا كَانَ لِيَأْخُذَ أَخَاهُ. He was not able to take his brother fi deen al-malik illa an yasha Allah, in the deen of the king, except if Allah willed. So the deen of the king here, it seems to be clear that it means the law that the king was implementing in his land, because a situation had to be brought about where Yusuf was able to keep his brother according to the law of the king. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to keep him with him. So he called that Deen al-Malik, the law of the king. Okay, and in Surah Al-Fatiha, the verse that we're studying says Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. So there's a correlation between those. We want to unpack that more. Another couple verses that we want to look at about in relationship to this word is chapter 20, 114. And I think this relates to this verse that we just talked about, that the Malik has a deen. The Malik has a law. So we're going to see that in 21:14. Chapter 20, verse 114. So in chapter 20, verse 114, he says, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ. So exalted is Allah, al-Malik al-Haq, the true and accurate and real Malik, king. Okay, now what's the context of this verse? If we go to the verse before it, in chapter 20, verse 113, the verse right before it, the context is talking about the Quran. So he says, وَكَذَلِكَ أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا وَصَرَّفْنَا فِيهِ مِنَ الْوَعِيدِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ أَوْ يُحْدِثُ لَهُمْ ذِكْرًا. He says, and likewise we have sent it down as an Arabi Quran, which, by the way, I don't believe Arabi means Arabic as a language, but that's something we can talk about in another class. And we distributed within it. For some reason I couldn't say that word. We distributed within it al-wa'id, different forms of warning, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَّقُونَ, so that perhaps they might have taqwa, أَوْ يُحْدِثُ لَهُمْ ذِكْرًا, or a reminder would be brought up, or it would bring up a reminder for them. The Quran would bring up a reminder for them. So that's verse 113. Then 114 starts, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ. So exalted is Allah, the true king. So this phrase, exalted is Allah, the true king, is in what context? Is in the context of talking about the Quran. And then when you continue reading, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ, then he says, وَلَا تَعْجَلْ بِالْقُرْآنِ مِنْ قَبَلِ أَنْ يُقْضَى إِلَيْكَ وَحْيُ. And do not hasten or rush with the Quran before its revelation has been completed to you. وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. And say, my Lord, increase me in knowledge. So I was just skimming down a little bit to see the connections. The Quran just has so much stuff. But see, the context of him saying Malikul Haq, the true king, is in the context, like the verse that comes before it is about وَكَذَلِكَ أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا. We sent it down as a Quran Arabi. And verse 114, the verse that the phrase is in, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ, right after it is about the Quran. وَلَا تَعْجَلْ بِالْقُرْآنِ. So this phrase, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ, this phrase calling Allah al-Malikul Haq, the true king, is like bookended by the Quran on both sides. It's talking about the Quran on both sides of it, and this phrase is in the middle. Al-Malik al-Haq, the true king. So putting that together with Deen al-Malik, that the Malik has a deen, and here Allah is Al-Malik al-Haq, and the Quran is on both sides of it, then that can help us to start to unpack what is the deen. So the deen of the Malik, in this case Allah, has something to do with the Quran. These are his laws. Follow me? And we'll continue to talk more and more about that word. But I wanted to show you that here. And also, another interesting thing about Allah being called Al-Malik is if we look in 59:23. So if we look in 59:23, so look at how the words are interchangeable to some degree. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but I think they complement each other. So let me show you what I mean. So 59:23, he says, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa hu. He is Allah, the one who there is no God except He. Al-Malikul Quddus. Al-Malik Al-Quddus. So here he's called Al-Malik first, the king, and then Al-Quddus. What does Al-Quddus mean? Roughly translated like the holy or the pure. Okay? But we're gonna explore this meaning or this word a little bit more in a second. Right? But what I want to point out is, look how in one verse, that's why I said the words are not interchangeable, meaning they mean the same thing and you can just switch them, but they overlap is probably a better way of saying it. So in one verse he says Al-Malikul Haq, the true Malik, the true king. In another verse he says Al-Malik Al-Quddus, the holy king. Okay? Now, what does that mean? I thought somebody sent me a message. It's a Skype notification. It's about U.S. women's basketball. I was like, who's telling me about U.S. women's basketball in the middle of the class? Okay. So what's the meaning? Why would he call himself Al-Malik Al-Quddus and Al-Malik Al-Haq? Right? Okay, so another verse that can illuminate this a little bit is when we go to chapter 2. So if we go to chapter 2, in the beginning, I think it's around verse 30. It might be verse 30, actually. I think it is verse 30. Let's see. Yeah.
Does this have anything to do with like al-awd al-muqaddasa because of the root qaddasa?
Yeah, it's the same root. So roughly they translate it as holy, but the root meaning in Arabic of Qudus, I believe, if I recall correctly, has something to do with purity, right? So look at this, and they translate in different ways. Sometimes they translate it as, like in this verse.
I'll have to go back and check my notes from Sammy.
Yeah, I think in this verse that I'm going to read now, chapter 2, verse 30, I think they might translate it as sanctify. But they're all words that kind of revolve around the same meaning, basically. So in this verse, he says, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And when your Lord said to the angels, I'm going to place a khalifa in the earth. قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ. They said, are you going to place therein those who would cause corruption therein and shed blood? Okay, so the angels mentioned two things, right? Follow the context. The angels mentioned two things. You're going to place therein the one who will cause corruption and shed blood. And now look how they describe themselves. They describe themselves with two things. وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ, one, وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. And we glorify your praises, and nuqaddisu lak. We make things nuqaddis. We do taqdis from that same word, quddus. I think they translate it as we sanctify things for you, I believe, right? So, let's see. I believe that's how they translate it. we sanctify things for you. Let's double check though. Actually here, I think some translations do, but here he says, extol thy holiness. Okay. But see, it has something to do with holy, purity, sanctification. But an easy way to understand this verse actually and relate it back to Allah describing himself as Al-Malik Al-Quddus is to think about the symmetry of the verse. The fact that when the angels objected to when Allah said he was going to place a Khalifa, and they asked, whether you want to say they asked or they objected, however we say it, they asked this question, Ataj'alu fiha, are you going to place therein man yufsidu fiha? Number one, the one who would cause corruption in it. So that was the first thing. What was the first thing they described themselves with? وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ. Well, we glorify your praises. But see, the word tasbih, nusabbihu, that we're translating as glorify your praises. Remember in some other classes we talked about tasbih, or it might have been in a video that I mentioned this. Tasbih, the root word of it, sabaha, means to swim. So it's first and foremost referencing movement, the way that you move. So you see how these things are like made the opposites. Are you going to place therein the one who will cause corruption? And we nusabbihu bihamdik. The way we move is according to your laws. We don't cause corruption. The second objection was وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء, and they will shed blood. And their second thing was وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ, we will make things holy, like sacred, like off limits, right? You know how something is holy, you don't do any wrong to it. You don't want to do any wrong to it. It's off limits. You respect it, right? So you see how like the symmetry of the verse, each thing that the angel mentioned as an objection, the angels mentioned as an objection, perhaps we can think of what they said about themselves as the opposite of each one of those things. So nuqaddisu laka, we sanctify or make things holy or purify things for you, is the opposite of shedding blood. And shedding blood is to consider something to not be sacred. Because in other places in the Quran, he tells us about killing a soul, harram Allah, which Allah made harrama tahrim, like off limits, right? So not just forbidden, haram means something that's off limits, right? That's why it's also used in some of the translations of the word haram sometimes is sacred, because we say al-baytul haram. Ja'ala Allahu al-Ka'bata al-bayt al-haram. Allah made the Kaaba al-bayt al-haram, the sacred house. So Allah made the killing of a nafs tahrim, haram. He made it sacred, off limits. So here, when he said yasfiku dima, they shed blood, the opposite of that was nuqaddisu lak, we make things holy, sacred, pure, off limits. So if that's, and Allah knows best, that seems to me to be a good way to think about it. So if you apply that back to Al-Malik Al-Quddus, why does Allah call himself Al-Malik Al-Quddus? Because as we read in the story of Sulaiman, when the woman who was ruling them said, Innal muluka idha dakhalu qaryatan afsaduha. The kings, when they enter a town, they corrupt it, they overturn it, they spoiled it. So Allah is Al-Malik Al-Quddus because kings and people in power tend to be corrupt and tend to spoil things and oppress people. But Allah is Al-Malik Al-Quddus. So he is the holy in being the king and being the one in control. So he does not oppress, he does not do wrong. He does not treat people in other than the way that they deserve to be treated. So those are some of the meanings of the word Malik, or the root word Mim, Lam, and Kaf. Hopefully that illuminates.
So would Allah not be Al-Qudus without being Al-Malik? As in, he would have to be Al-Malik to be Al-Qudus.
That's a good question. I didn't think about that, so I'm going to actually look it up right now. to see if Allah ever describes himself as Quddus without Malik. I don't think so, but I could be wrong because I didn't think about looking at that. So let me check it out real quick. Yeah, he only describes himself. I thought that was the case. He only describes himself as Al Quddus 2 times in the Quran. The one that we read, 59:23, and the second one, which was 62:1, where he says, يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. I think is the end of the ayah. He says, glorifies him, makes tasbih for Allah, whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth, al-Malik al-Quddus. So yeah, the only 2 times al-Quddus is mentioned is in connection with al-Malik. So that's a good observation. Al-Quddus as a description of Allah. It's mentioned in other places about other things like al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, Ruh al-Qudus. There's other usages of it. Nuqaddisu lak. So hopefully, inshallah, that illuminates some of the meaning of the beginning of this phrase in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maaliki or Maaliki Yawm Ad-Deen. And inshallah, it's 1:57, so we want to get ready for the live class too. So inshallah, we'll pick up on that next week. I appreciate everybody coming. Good to see you guys again. And those who are coming, I'll see you in like 3 minutes on the live. Assalamu alaikum.